It's important that we realize that we have a responsibility over here. We need to take up the fight when it comes to this.
Now, as the Act currently stands, it is weighted very much in favor of equality at the expense of other constitutional rights. You can believe in your heart whatever you want to believe, but we don't want to see it and we don't want to hear it. The church pointed to its biblical beliefs that marriage is between a man and a woman, and on that basis said, well, these are religious convictions and they also are constitutionally protected. The minister will be able to issue regulations and codes of good practice that will determine what equality and no unfair discrimination will look like in organizations, and that includes businesses, it also includes churches and religious organizations.
If we see where the liberal movement is going in England and America and those places, they do seem to be getting more and more socialistic.
And then in addition to that, we need to know that particularly the liberal, or let's call it then the LGBT lobby, they have a very well-funded, well-organized global strategy in terms of how are they going to bring in these progressive laws into country.
What do we as Christians do? I mean, the picture you painted for us is actually a very dangerous picture.
And I think there were about 40-something submissions from the Christian community and about 400-something submissions from the liberals, particularly from the LGBT community. And the parliamentarians simply said, the committee said, well, the people of South Africa have spoken. And that bill was passed, in favor of more liberal rights and against religious freedom rights. And so often you're in a situation where a judge will say, well, I can do no other. This is what the law says. I have to apply it. And so that's why it's very important for us as Christians to get involved in the law-making process.
Tonight, we have an interesting debate around the PEPUDA Amendment Bill. Now, many of you have probably heard about the PEPUDA Amendment Bill through various little videos that have been coming through on WhatsApp. And we've been hearing from Nadene Badenhorst from 4SA. Tonight, we have Nadene with us so that we can get a bit more detail around what the effect of this bill is going to have on South Africa as a whole and on us as Christians, and potentially how this fits into the ideology that is currently being promoted in South Africa. Good evening, Nadene. How are you this evening?
Hi, Richard. Lovely to be with you. Hello, aan die kykers.
Nadene, the PEPUDA Amendment Bill, it comes from obviously the Equality Act and everything. Where did the Equality Act originate from and why was it created? What was the purpose of the Equality Act?
All right. So the Equality Act, or otherwise known as PEPUDA, the acronym, which stands for the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. Now, that is an existing act that was adopted in 2000 already, and exactly what the name of the act says. So that act aims to put everyone on equal footing before the law, and it also contains the prohibition against unfair discrimination, either by the state or by any other person on a number of prohibited grounds, whether it be race, language, gender, sex, sexual orientation, but also importantly, religion, conscience, and belief. And so what it really does is it gives teeth to very similar guarantees that we have in our Constitution, which says that everyone is equal before the law, deserves equal treatment before the law, and that no one may be unfairly discriminated against on any of those grounds.
So the first draft, the first act that was instituted, did we have any problems? Did you as Force have any problems with the original act?
Well, Richard, 4SA wasn't in existence at the time yet. 4SA was only created in 2014, so we're in our 8th year of existence. But what I can tell you is that the existing act, in other words, even before we get to the PEPUDA Amendment Bill, is a very problematic act. So whoever was responsible for how the act was written at the time and whoever did or didn't participate in the act, we really have a problem situation. And when I say we, I'm speaking about people of faith and Christians in particular, because already now, as the act currently stands, it is weighted very much in favor of equality at the expense of other constitutional rights, such as religious freedom. And so already we have a situation, and 4SI has been involved in numerous court cases where increasingly Christians, whether it be pastors or Christian business people or parents, as well as Christian ministries and churches, denominations, are being taken to court in terms of the existing act, simply because people have shared what they believe, or they have lived out their beliefs. And as we know, increasingly our Christian beliefs are being seen as fundamentalist, as politically incorrect, archaic, and therefore the message increasingly is you can believe in your heart whatever you want to believe, but we don't want to see it and we don't want to hear it. And so for that reason, even in terms of the existing act already, we find that Christians are coming under fire and being taken to court in terms of the existing provisions of the act.
Can you give us some examples of that? I mean, examples of the matter and what the court saw, how the court ruled on those matters.
Absolutely. I've actually got a whole list of court cases, but maybe I can categorize them. So typically the court cases that are being opened up against people of faith take one of two forms. So either they take the form of hate speech complaints. In other words, someone has said something that someone else doesn't like or doesn't agree with or finds offensive, and then they open up a hate speech case. Or on the other hand, they open up unfair discrimination cases in terms of the existing act. And that is typically where someone has done something. So they've distinguished between people on the basis of, for instance, sexual orientation or religious conviction. And for that reason, someone feels you've treated me differently, you've discriminated against me. And then they would open up an unfair discrimination case against an individual or a church denomination. So some examples. A case that we are involved in right now is a case that's been opened up against a Christian independent school in Johannesburg. Now, this school subscribes to biblical values, and so they don't believe in connections with their ancestors. And so what happened was there was a little Zulu boy, 9 years old, who arrived with a isipandla. Now, that is that wristband that many of the Africans wear around their wrist, and it signifies a spiritual connection with the ancestor. And so he arrived with this wristband at school, and the school said, that goes against our biblical beliefs and convictions, and for that reason, we're going to have to send you home with your schoolwork so that the isipanda, which cannot be taken off, but has to, in terms of the cultural belief, fall off naturally, so that it can fall off naturally, and then you can return to school. Now, the parents were not happy about that, and they actually brought a case in terms of the existing act against the school, saying that the school has now infringed on their cultural beliefs. Interestingly, they also claim to be Christians from a religious perspective, but they say culturally they also hold to these beliefs in terms of the ancestors and so forth. And they've actually claimed damages against the school. I think the amount is 200,000 rand. So that's a typical example of how the existing act is already being used against a Christian independent school to say, well, really the 99% of Christians now have to accommodate the 1% who believes differently. So that's but one example. But there are numerous examples, and maybe some well-known cases. The Ecclesia de Lange case that went all the way to the Constitutional Court. Ecclesia de Lange was a pastor of the Methodist Church who wanted to marry a same-sex partner. And then the Methodist Church said, you're still welcome to come to church. But if you want to serve on the leadership of the church, then you have to hold to the same values that we hold to, because otherwise, how can you lead the people in our values, in our beliefs? And she took, in terms of the existing Equality Court, or existing Equality Act, she instituted an unfair discrimination claim against the Methodist Church. And she took it all the way to the Constitutional Court, lost in the Constitutional Court, but very importantly, lost on a legal technical point. And frighteningly, the Constitutional Court in that case said if a similar case had to become before them, presented in legally, technically the right way, they would be prepared to look at the doctrines of the church to see if they measure up to the Constitution. So that effectively opens up the door to the courts already in terms of the existing act, checking whether the church's doctrines and internal workings are in line with this constitutional ideology, of equality and unfair discrimination. There are numerous other examples, but perhaps those are two very apposite ones.
That is a very dangerous statement made there by the court, because how does that affect our right to our own ideological beliefs? Because you're not allowed to be discriminated against based on ideology or religious beliefs. I mean, that is also part of the Equality Act. So how's the court going to balance these two if it's making statements like that?
Richard, and that's exactly where the problem comes in, because the Equality Act, as I said just now, is the way in which it is written, it's weighted so heavily in favor of equality and a specific ideology of what equality is, actually at the expense of other constitutional rights. So, for instance, when the court looks at whether there's been unfair discrimination, and remember, it's not discrimination in our law that is prohibited, it's unfair discrimination. In other words, there is such a thing as fair discrimination in our law. So, firstly, the court will look at, well, has there been discrimination? Have different people been treated differently? So, yes, in the case of Ecclesia, for instance, she was treated differently. She wasn't allowed to serve on the leadership of the church any longer. But then the question is, was it nonetheless fair or unfair discrimination? In other words, was there a legitimate reason in law why the church said you can no longer serve on leadership? And of course, the church pointed to its biblical beliefs that marriage is between a man and a woman. And on that basis said, well, these are religious convictions and they also are constitutionally protected. There is no hierarchy of rights in the Constitution. All rights are of equal importance. But the problem is that the way in which the Equality Act is written, and there's a specific test that a number of factors that the court has to take into account to see whether it is fair discrimination or unfair discrimination. And one of the factors that is mentioned is, does this person who complains that he or she has been unfairly discriminated against, do they form part of a category of persons who have typically been discriminated against in the past? And it is just there that Christians, in a sense, pull on the short end of the stick all the time. Because, of course, the answer is yes, even though, Ecclesia may have been in a very, even though she herself maybe hasn't necessarily been in a disadvantaged position in the past, she's formed part of a group, LGBT group who's been disadvantaged in the past. And for that very reason, then the court will weigh up these rights and find for that reason sexual orientation weighs more heavily than religious freedom. So unfortunately, in the balancing of these things, that's often where it goes wrong. Because we have such a liberal constitution and because South Africa wants to be seen to be this champion of, sexual rights, having been, I think, the first country to have actually written it into their constitution, fifth country in the world to have legalized same-sex marriage. So, yes, there is this thing about South Africa needing to be the champion of sexual orientation rights in particular.
So we already have a problem. So how does the amendment how does it affect this problem that we're looking at?
It is going to make it 100 times worse, Richard, for different reasons. So as I said, already the existing act is used as a club to bludgeon Christians, in a sense, to put an easy target on the back of Christians and denominations and churches. And the amendment bill will just make it so much easier. The first thing that it will do, we have various concerns, but the first thing it will do is it will now provide state-funded legal aid to any person who feels they've been the victim of hate speech or unfair discrimination. In other words, it's like an open door, an invitation. Come, bring your cases, and we, the state, will pay for your legal representation. Whereas if you are on the receiving end, if you are accused in that matter, accused of hate speech or accused of unfair discrimination, you will have to pay for the litigation out of your own pocket. So in a sense, that in itself is discriminatory, because in a sense, it's like you're almost already guilty and you have to prove your innocence now and do it by paying out of your own pocket. So that in itself is a major concern. Then the second very big concern is that it stretches the definitions of equality and unfair discrimination in the Act beyond what the Constitution intended and beyond the ordinary meaning of those words. So equality, already explained, is seen in the Constitution and in the existing Act as equal treatment before the law. But what this amendment bill proposes is that equality will basically mean that everyone is equal in every single way. So you have equal rights and access to benefits, opportunities, to resources. So there's no distinction whatsoever. Now we can just think of the ramifications of that for every single sphere of society. That's why the banks are also up in arms. You know, it's not just for SA who has concerns about this bill, but from a religious freedom point of view, it will mean that religious organizations, for instance, can no longer draw distinctions between people when they consider who are they going to accept as members of the church, who are they going to appoint as leaders of the church or as employees of the church. And that may mean that because everyone is equal in every way and has equal access to work opportunities or leadership or membership, that even if someone holds the completely different convictions to that particular church, they may have to consider appointing that person as a member or as a leader or as an employee. So it completely overrides religious autonomy and the right of religious organizations to associate with like-minded members and leaders and employees. So that's just on the equality aspect.
Okay, I'm trying to understand how the courts are going to be able to allow that sort of leeway. I mean, because you still have the right of freedom of association, which has to be maintained as well, and which has to form part of the process of balance of powers. So how do you see that falling into it? Because I know that it's something that has never really been brought into the fray when it comes to legal argument, that freedom of association, but it's still there, and it still has to be given effect to. Is it not?
Yeah, Richard, I absolutely agree with you. You know, again, I want to say that in our Constitution, our Constitutional Court has been very emphatic that there is indeed no hierarchy of rights. That means that every single constitutional right, whether it be the equality rights, religious freedom, freedom of association, stand on equal footing. They are all equally important. And yet, as I said, when it comes down to the application of these things and the weighing process, we find that because equality is such a preeminent value in our Constitution, given our history of apartheid, that is almost the value that often, when it comes down to the application of the weighing of these rights, that often carries greater weight with the court than any other value. And so we find that even in other court cases, for instance, in the Ecclesia de Lange case or the Gaum versus Dutch Reformed Church, all of those cases where we've advanced those arguments on freedom of association, it's almost as if the court doesn't really go there and prefer to decide it on equality because it is such a preeminent value in our Constitution. And importantly, what this amendment bill says is that, in fact, government has to, or there has to be a complete overhaul of all laws, all policies, all codes of practices in South Africa to fit in now with what this particular act, how it defines equality, how it defines unfair discrimination. So, and what we mean by that, it is the state's particular ideological idea of what equality is and no unfair discrimination. And it even goes so far as to say that the minister will be able to issue regulations and codes of good practice that will determine what equality and no unfair discrimination will look like in organizations, and that includes businesses. It also includes churches and religious organizations. Now, in our case, it will probably be the Carter minister, the very same minister who issued what many would argue have been the draconian COVID regulations. So she will be able to say what should equality look like in the workplace for churches, and that will most certainly go to issues of appointment of leaders, employees, membership, and so forth. And of course, if you don't comply, you should expect heavy sanctions. So this is definitely state regulation through the front door, and it completely overrides religious autonomy, because this act is the preeminent piece of legislation in South Africa, just under the Constitution. So really, whatever any other rights or laws is doesn't matter as much, because this is the law that will have the preeminence.
So do you think this is just a manifestation of the state's ideology of communism, which they've been very open about, to create a society where of absolute equality? Well, it's never absolute equality, because we always have elite within society, within the communist setup. But do you think that this is a manifestation of that?
I think some people would definitely say so, Richard. I think it's a complex answer. Maybe that's not the only answer, because this law that we're seeing here is very similar to laws that are being passed in other Western countries. The Equality Act, for instance, in America, that is as far-reaching, as detrimental for religious rights. The same in Australia, the same in the UK. But then definitely when we look at the state control that is exercised over individual lives, over businesses, over religious denominations, it certainly has that socialist flavor to it. And I think that is something that we've in particular seen play out in the last year. We must remember that regulation of religion is something that's been on the table for the last number of years, and this is just another form of it. So I don't think it would be incorrect to say that definitely that is a big factor.
Well, it was interesting you mentioned America and Australia and all those sort of things. Let's give it a bit of an international look at it. It seems to be that these laws seem to be coming from the same sector of society, that more liberal-oriented society. And if we see where the liberal movement is going in England and America and those places, they do seem to be getting more and more socialistic in their outlook. Would you agree with that statement?
I would agree, Richard. We definitely, people often ask, where do these things come from? And we started the conversation with that, the Department of Justice. But definitely, increasingly, we are seeing that from the United Nations often, these kind of very liberal, very progressive, particularly on the issue when it comes to sexual orientation rights and gender rights. That's where it's coming from. And then in addition to that, we need to know that particularly the liberal, or let's call it then the LGBT lobby, they have a very well-funded, well-organized global strategy in terms of how are they going to bring in these progressive laws into country. And then we know also, particularly in the African continent, there's often financial aid that is tied to these kind of laws. We saw it with the comprehensive sexuality education, where we'll give money to you, but then you need to implement these laws. So yes, there's definitely the external pressure, and then there are the, let's call it, internal or local agendas, which are also promoted, of course.
Okay, so what do we as Christians do? I mean, the picture you painted for us is actually a very dangerous picture. If we look at what's happened to many pastors in other countries where they've been thrown in jail and that sort of thing, and I mean, if we look even in America, where certain of the Democrat states, where the pastors were being told that they need to bring their sermons to the politicians so that they can be approved on all these sort of things. What do we as Christians do in situations like this?
Richard, nou dat jy noem, miskien kan ek sommer net 'n bietjie Afrikaans praat, nou dat jy noem van die dominees wat hulle sermons moes neem. Jy weet, ook in Suid-Afrika begin dit gereeld gebeur. In my eie kerk het ons 'n situasie gehad waar ateïste letterlik ons preke afgelaai het van die internet, en hulle gaan kyk en sekere gedeeltes uitgehaal waar hulle gevoel het ons sê goeders wat hulle nie saamstem nie, wat hulle nie van hou nie, wat hulle vind as aanstootlik, en hulle het, my spesifieke kerk is aangegee by die Kommissie vir Geslagsgelykheid, bloot omdat ons gesê het dat, jy weet, niemand is gay gebore nie, en Jesus kan mense vrymaak uit 'n gay leefstyl, en hulle het gesê dit is haatspraak. So alreeds is daar hierdie kyk na die preke wat gegee word, en om selektief daaruit aan te haal en mense te gaan, of kerke te gaan aangee as mense nie saamstem nie. So it's already happening in South Africa. And as I said, everyone, if you're a Christian in South Africa today, you have a target on your back, whether you are a parent, whether you're a pastor, whether you're a politician, whether you are a teacher, whether you're a psychologist, whether you're a lawyer. No one is immune against this anti-religion liberal agenda. So absolutely, as Christians, I believe we need to firstly be aware of what is happening, but then, like the sons of Issachar, not just be aware of what's happening, but actually know what to do about it. And so often people will say, well, is it right? Because as Christians, we also see scriptures such as obey the government. And some people take that to an extreme end where, well, we shouldn't say anything against what government is proposing. But is that in fact biblical? And I want to propose to you, Richard, that we have a very good model in the Bible, actually, in the Apostle Paul. You know, when he was arrested, and it happened on 2 occasions, he stood on his rights as a Roman citizen. Firstly, to say, you've not actually flogged me without a hearing and put me in jail without a hearing, and you cannot do that to a Roman citizen. And then a third time also where he actually used his rights to appeal to Caesar rather than to be heard by the Jewish Sanhedrin. And he used his rights as a Roman citizen really so that the gospel could be furthered, so that there was an opportunity for him to continue to spread the gospel. And so in the same way in South Africa, we as citizens have been given democratic rights. We have been given rights to participate in the lawmaking process. That is why the Department of Justice puts out a bill like this and say, we're giving 30 calendar days, you know, or whatever for public comments. And really, we only have ourselves to blame if we don't use that opportunity. And if bad laws are then made that will last for generations, because once these laws are made, it's not so easy to pull back on them. So we have a biblical model actually for saying we've been given rights and we've got to use those rights to make sure that the doors for the gospel in South Africa and for our freedom to freely share our faith and live our faith remain open. And we do that by making submissions when there is an opportunity. And from 4SA's side, you know, we put many resources on our website. We even often make template submissions that people can literally copy paste as is, but send something in. It needn't be long, but say something. And if I can give maybe 2 examples of how a voice can make a difference, a positive example and a negative example. You know, we were involved in another bill a few years ago that was also a grave danger for religious freedom rights in that particular issue for state religious marriage officers. And I remember being in Parliament that day, and literally there were 2 stacks of paper, you know, before the person who was the parliamentarian. And I think there were about 40-something submissions from the Christian community and about 400-something submissions from the liberals, particularly from the LGBT community. And the parliamentarian simply said, the committee said, well, the people of South Africa have spoken. And that bill was passed, you know, in favor of more liberal rights and against religious freedom rights. Yeah. So that's not good. A positive example is where the hate crimes and hate speech bill, which also posed a massive threat to our freedom as believers to share our faith. That bill was on the table a few years ago, and government received 60,000 submissions, the majority of which came from the religious community. And as a result of that massive pushback, we were able to convince the Department of Justice to write in a religious exemption clause to protect people when they say things that are based on scripture. And so that is a positive example of where our voice has been able to make a difference. So do not think your voice doesn't matter. If everybody thinks that way, the 80% of Christians in South Africa thinks that way, you know, then our religious rights will just be trampled underfoot. So we have an opportunity and we must use it.
But don't you find that even when we make these inroads, one thing I've noticed is that we make these inroads, like you said, you had that amendment made to protect the religious rights and everything like that. And all that happens is we have a court case that ends up in front of a liberal judge, and it gets undermined immediately. I mean, it's typical of what happened when it came to discipline and the right of the discipline defense. Don't you feel that it seems to be because we're not as organized as the left when it comes to our religious groupings and stuff, that we seem to fall back the whole time?
I agree with you, Richard, but that's why it's so important to be part of the lawmaking process, because remember, what judges do is they need to apply the law. And so often you're in a situation where a judge will say, well, I can do no other. This is what the law says. I have to apply it. And so that's why it's very important for us as Christians to get involved in the law-making process, because those are the laws that will ultimately be applied, and to make sure that the laws are as narrow as possible, to give the judges as little room as possible, almost for creative interpretation and interpretation that goes against our religious rights. A good example, perhaps, is the Kwelane case. Now, John Kwelane was a journalist, and he wrote an article in the newspaper a few years ago where he said, "Call me names, but gay is not okay." And his case, again, was taken all the way to the Constitutional Court. And again, it was a hate speech case that was instituted against him in terms of the existing Equality Act. And the existing Equality Act has a very broad definition of hate speech that goes much further than the Constitution, because it includes this very subjective element of, if someone just feels that their feelings have been hurt, that would have been enough to establish hate speech. And so many people, many pastors, many Christians have been found or have been accused of hate speech simply because someone else feels that their feelings have been hurt. But now, many years later, I mean, the act was passed in 2000, the existing act, and it was only, I think, last year or the year before that the Supreme Court of Appeal found that that definition of hate speech in the existing act is too broad, is too wide, and it was struck down. And so it has now been changed. But how many cases have come before the courts, and how many people have been found guilty of hate speech simply because of a definition that should not have been there in the first place, and it was overbroad? So once again, just to highlight, that's what's important, that we get involved and make sure that whatever's written into the laws is as narrow as possible and gives as little room as possible for us as believers to be brought before the courts and ultimately found guilty of simply sharing or living out our faith.
There's a bit of an issue, though, because, I mean, I've heard in many churches and things where they say we shouldn't get involved as Christians when it comes to political issues, or when it comes to these sort of things that are taking place. What would you say to church leaders when it comes to those sort of messages that are being given to not get involved? That, you know, I think the scripture that is usually used is that we're a part of this world, but we're not of this world, and therefore we shouldn't get involved. What is your message to Christian leaders when it comes to that?
Yeah. Look, Richard, obviously there are different theologies on these things. You know, some people would hold to kind of a seven mountains theology and saying, you know, Christians should influence every sphere of society and work for Christian laws, you know, and really ultimately work for a Christian government, you know, on the extreme end of it. And I think you know, different people would hold to different views in that regard. But certainly when it comes to religious freedom, I would implore our leaders to stand with us, to hold the line on religious freedom. Because what we're doing here is it's freedom of choice. Religious freedom means people can still believe whatever they want to believe. But if the atheists are free to believe what they want to believe, or the Hindus or the Muslims or the LGBT people, by the same token, Christians should be free to believe what they want to believe, and be equally free to share our beliefs and to live out our beliefs. So it's not telling other people what they should or shouldn't believe, but simply saying, give us that equal space to freely share our beliefs, whether it be from the pulpit, from social media, with our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues, and give us equal space to live out our beliefs. So it's, in a sense, an offensive line that we are holding. And I think that is something that we should work for, because I think often, you know, we can idealize persecution and say, but look how the church is flourishing under persecution in China. Well, the church died under persecution in Russia. And how much better is it to live in a country where we are free to share our faith with our friends, our neighbors, our work colleagues, and not worry about the police knocking on the door because, you know, someone saw that we had a religious meeting next door. So for that very reason, I believe that it's important to stand with us for religious freedom and to make input where possible on laws that threaten our religious freedom.
Lovely. You know, this has been a very interesting conversation, and I think a lot of people have now learned something that they probably didn't know. Can you just tell me, this equality aspect has also crept into the new marriage act that seems to be emerging? How's it going to affect that environment as well?
Okay, so we're talking about something different but related now. So the situation in South Africa, Richard, with when it comes to marriages, is that we we don't have a single marriage act in South Africa that regulates all the different kind of marriages. In other words, same-sex marriages, opposite-sex marriages, monogamous marriages, polygamous marriages, religious marriages, cultural marriages. We have almost a fragmented system whereby different laws regulate different marriages, and in some instances, for some marriages, we have no laws at all. And so for that reason, and because some marriages have no legal recognition at all, some religious or some cultural marriages, again, in line with equality, it is important to bring everyone to the same standard where all of us have equal treatment before the law, and provided we meet the same legal requirements, that everyone can have their marriage legally recognized, whether it's a cultural marriage or religious marriage or whatever kind of marriage. So for that reason, government is now looking into creating a single marriage act. Could take different forms, but basically there will be one law that legally regulates all the different kind of marriages in South Africa, so that everyone is on equal legal footing. And that is a good thing. But where the problem comes in, number one, is that in terms of this new marriage policy that the Department of Home Affairs is proposing, it seems as if religious marriage officers may potentially, in the name of equality, be forced to solemnize all marriages, even if it goes against their own religious convictions and beliefs. And the reason for that is because up until now, the Marriage Act has had a specific clause that protects the freedom of religious marriage officers to not do marriages that do not line up with their own or the church's religious convictions and beliefs. But that's now being taken out. And the result might be that if there's no explicit protection, that one has to read it, well, as you then have to marry all people. And that is exactly what the Department of Home Affairs is saying, that we should no longer almost be able to hide behind the religious facade and actually just discriminate against people because we don't like same-sex couples getting married. So the effect of that might be that, for instance, a Christian marriage officer may be forced to solemnize a polygamous marriage, or a Hindu marriage officer may be forced to solemnize a Muslim marriage, or Muslim marriage officer may be forced to solemnize an LGBT marriage, even if it goes against his or his mosque's own religious convictions. And clearly that is an untenable situation. And for that reason, 4SI is also making submissions on this policy to say, no, there should be explicit protection for religious marriage officers to only solemnize marriages that line up with their own religious convictions and beliefs. And this is indeed the position in most Western democracies, including very progressive democracies such as Canada, United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia. South Africa would be completely out of step with the rest of the world if we had to force people to do things that violate their conscience.
Okay, Nadene, I want to ask you a last question. Well, maybe not a last question, but the president of the country recently signed a proclamation which says that people working for the state may no longer refuse to solemnize marriages that are against their religious belief. What is FORSA going to do about this? Because to me, this is against the Labor Relations Act and all these sort of things, where person has the right of religious freedom and all, and there is within the state especially a greater capacity to be able to accommodate religious beliefs and all these sort of things. What does FORSA foresee that they can do about a situation like that? And what are how are the churches supposed to get involved in this? Because I think this is probably a place where those that are of similar belief could probably have an effect that would start having an influence and making them more the salt and the light at the end of the day.
Yeah. So, Richard, obviously that refers to state marriage officers. So, I was very involved from the beginning in terms of making submissions on that bill to say that the right to religious freedom, the constitutional right to religious freedom, is not limited only to persons who do not work for the state, to pastors or non-state employees. It's a right that belongs to everyone. And as a constitutional court has often said, it's a right that you take with you into the workplace. You take it with you. You don't leave it at home in the mornings when you go to work. And so for us from the beginning, we contended that even for state marriage officers, they should have the right to conscientious objection, which they've always had if they do not feel comfortable with the particular marriage. Unfortunately, as I said, that was the particular bill on which they weren't many submissions that came from the traditional side, and many more submissions from the Liberal side, as a result of which that bill was passed into law. And the president actually signed the Civil Union Amendment Bill into law, as a result of which state marriage officers can now be forced by law to solemnize marriages against their religious convictions and beliefs. However, if this new marriage policy that government is proposing goes through, it effectively opens up the whole conversation again, because the Civil Union Act would now also fall away. So in a sense, the issues on the table again, on the one hand, we may feel that the ship has perhaps sailed, or the writing's on the wall, because in a sense, the law has already been passed, indicating clearly how government feels about it. But there is another opportunity. And perhaps more pressingly, I want to say there's an opportunity for us to protect the religious freedom of religious marriage officers and their organizations. So at the very least, we need to put in submissions on that. Similar to the PEPUDA Amendment Bill, we don't have a lot of time. We have 9 days only. The marriage policy also is only open for comments until the 30th of June. But for that one too, we have prepared a template submission for individuals and organizations. It is available on the 4SA website. Download it. We've done all the work for you. Fill it in, send it in. It's so important to make our voice heard on these issues.
Fantastic. Can you just give your website out again so that we can make sure that people have it?
So it's www.forsa, that's forsa.org.za, and people can also follow us on Facebook at Freedom of Religion SA.
Nadene, I want to say thank you very much. I think we've covered a lot of ground in this interview. I hope that you will join us again in the future when we discuss something that come up. And I just want to say to our viewers out there, this is very important that we become involved. We can no longer afford to just be on the sideline. If we are going to make a difference in this nation, we are going to have to get involved, and we're going to have to support people like Nadene and Freedom of Religion SA that are there trying to fight us. And I think it's paramount that we start speaking to everyone around us about these things and start garnering support so that we become a voice within society. We are still a large portion of the society, and we have to use that influence if we are going to bring about a change, because we are heading in a direction that I think is very dangerous, and that if we do not stop that, we are going to end up creating a society that, for our children especially, that is going to be very difficult for them to live out their faith and to live out that which we have so been able to do for such a long time. And I think it's our responsibility to make a difference. Thank you very much, Nadene, and
thank you, Richard.
I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is the show for this evening. We want to thank Nadene Badenhorst for joining us. It's important that we realize that we have a responsibility over here. We need to take up the fight when it comes to this. We need to organize ourselves as churches, as civil society, and we need to speak up against this bill. Visit the website and fill in the submission form so that we can make our voices heard. It's important if we are going to have an effect in this nation. We are still the largest grouping in South Africa, yet we have the least influence at the moment. It is important that we go ahead and we do this so that we can make a change. If you have enjoyed this show, please like our page, and we will be back again next week. We hope you will join us, and we hope that you will see us as a place to come listen and get information in the future. Please like this page, share it to as many people as you possibly can, and make sure that this message gets out. Thank you very much, and God bless.